Hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to Teach Me Geography Icons, second event of this academic year. My name's Gemma Keane and I'm one of the coordinators for Teach Me Geography Icons, and somewhere in the background of StreamYard will be Kelly Pepin, who's taken ownership of all of the social media posts today in order to celebrate and make your presentations as far-reaching as they possibly can be. We'd like to start by personally thanking everybody that has been involved with the creation and the organisation of this event. That's all of our fantastic speakers who have taken obviously the time and the energy to put together some wonderful presentations. We've had the privilege of seeing kind of sneak previews of these beforehand, and they look absolutely incredible. So I think you'll be in for a really useful and beneficial 2 hours. All of the Teach Meets team for supporting us with the prep and that organisation, the graphic design and everything else that an event like this entails. So without further ado, we will start with our first event sponsor, okay, and that will be Discover the World. So we're very grateful for Discover the World, and they've got a 5-minute slot now. So over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sarah. I'm from Discover the World Education. We're delighted to be sponsoring the Teach Meet again for another year. And I won't keep you long because I know you'll be wanting to get on to all the amazing presentations that are coming up. But I will just give you a little bit of an introduction to Discover the World if you've not heard of us before. We specialise in geography field trips to a range of destinations that you can see there. Why choose Discover the World over there's many different companies? We do specialise in geography trips. We have been doing for over 40 years, and our team is made up of former teachers and travel experts that really do love putting these trips together and giving your students the best possible experience. We are quality assured members of the School Travel Forum, and we have all the usual financial bonding, etc. But we really do know the places that we visit. If you have a look on our website, you'll see that we've got some exciting new Norway itineraries. For the first time, we've got summer Norway itineraries, which to the Voss and Hardangerfjord Fjord area. So have a look and get in touch with me if you want to find out a bit more about those. We're also really proud to be partners with the Geographical Association and the Field Studies Council. And as part of our partnership with the GA, we organise a number of free CPD workshops as well as free teaching resources. And on the screen there, you can just see details of a free CPD workshop we've got coming up in a couple of months at our offices, run in partnership with the Field Studies Council and the GA. And we'll be looking at how you can really get the most out of field work and also out of school trips. And it's free of charge to come along. So have a look on the website for more information about that CPD. As I said, we also offer a number of free teaching resources, which are all available on our website. And you might have seen every Christmas and summer, wonderful Joe Coles puts together a quiz for us. And our latest quiz is available now for a bit of fun, but also a good challenge towards the end of term. And if you just hover on that QR code, it should bring it up. But if not, it's available on our website. Something new that we're doing as well is our Ultimate Geography Teacher CPD, which you can also find details on our website. This is an immersive CPD being run in Iceland in coordination with Richard Alloway and Matt Podbury and Karen from Discover the World. And that's next June. And as well as a fantastic course in Iceland itself, there's also webinars before and after you go to get the most out of that CPD. So that's it really. I just want to say, please do get in touch if we can be of any help. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic morning. There's some really good speakers and I'm looking forward to hearing everything, but enjoy your day.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. I mean, some of those locations just seem amazing. You're making me wish away the last bit of summer term even more. And free CPD is always the winner. So thank you for sharing all of those opportunities that the attendees could look into. Thank you. Next up on our schedule is Helen Pipe. So a massive thank you to Helen, who is going to be discussing effective retrieval strategies with you. So over to you, Helen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'd want to share today a few retrieval strategies that I've been working on this year, linked to the science of learning. So with my faculty, I've been looking at these 6 things, and the key thing being that it's more than just to do now, although we'll be sharing some of those today with you as well, and how we can ensure that pupils have a strong knowledge bank, but also can articulate those as well. So these are just a few do nows that we use within lesson time. Again, looking at the core knowledge and having a variety of those tasks. So we've got a put the fill gaps in, write a paragraph, odd one out, a bit of a getting the point scoring there. And a lot of these are from Kate Jones's book, and can be applied to primary as well in geography. And it was about pupils being able to apply that knowledge in a variety of different scenarios, not just questions. Something else we've been looking at is formative assessment and hinge questions in lesson times. I like whiteboards, but I do find with some classes they can be a bit of a faff. So we've got A to D true false cards, which are just giving out and collected in at different points throughout the lesson. And throughout the lesson, they have these little throwback questions or checking they've got that core knowledge from the lesson. So these are a couple of examples that we've got on there about TNCs and fair trade. And it's really quick, scan across, looking for that 80% success rate, and then looking there whether I need to reteach anything or we can just move on to the next part of the lesson. So a really nice way of checking for understanding and checking knowledge. So this year for Year 11 in particular, I've put together a bank of resources. Their folders were huge by the time they went to leave, of fridge quizzes, multiple choice questions, retrieval activities, some case study recap, all making sure they've got everything they need and can be used at home. So I sent many messages home about how these can be used with parents, with friends at home, to coincide with their homework, to ensure, again, they know how to revise, not just reading or highlighting. So, for example, this is a multiple choice quiz, which we used in lesson time just before exams. So they've got some plausible distractors in there as well. And I basically just went through the spec and just wrote some retrieval questions, some quick multiple choice questions. And again, as I went through these from cold calling and call and response, again, I can immediately address some misconceptions or had to reteach anything. I could do that then on the back of these quizzes. Trying to think of wrong answers is sometimes more difficult than getting the right ones in. Tarsiers, again, there's loads of online makers of these, free makers, just writing questions, and they create this template which we put together, and pupils loved this during intervention. And it was great to hear pupils having discussions about why it was one thing and not the other. And again, hearing them recall definitions that I've taught them. So for example, attrition, it was nice to hear them say, knock together, break into smaller, smoother, rounder pieces. And you can have that little discussion. And again, as you're circulating, you could home in on any misconceptions and check in with pupils. And I found for intervention after school, they worked really, really well. And pupils were popping in saying, oh, can I do a quick task here, miss, before next lesson? And I think even year 10 heard about them and they came in as well. I wanted to have a go. And once you've got them, I'll just put more in a folder now. They're there forever. So these are some retrieval quick tasks people did at home. And they brought them back into school. I checked them, and then they got reward points for every ones they did, just using our reward system at school. So again, just the core knowledge, just from the spec, different sections. And again, people really liked working on those and checking in and again, having discussions. Lots of using them at form time. There wasn't a geography specific form. So they liked the fact they could just get them out and have a go and then pop them into me and I can check them. Making links, again, a bit more deeper knowledge now, showing how they understand the differences or the links between the points. So we've got historical factors affecting development. We've got a point linked to Rostow's model and development. Again, these can work for primary, any topics. These can link to anything. Elaborate this. So pupils I found weren't developing explanation very well, particularly not for 3 marks. So again, this is an opportunity for people to practice that. Check it in with me. I can check them, or you haven't used a fact, or you need to develop that one stage further, or that's incorrect. And I can address the misconceptions of pupils when we're circulating and checking in. Rubik Cube, they love these. Just a very quick way of just categorization. Worked really well for tiger and rainforest as well, and river landforms, whether it's erosion deposition. They work really nicely for. Fridge quizzes. So we had a whole bank of fridge quizzes that could be used at home or folded and, cover look check. Just looking again, just through the spec and just picking out a few ideas. I try to give a few examples, and parents was getting in touch saying they really enjoyed seeing what pupils were learning about, and they learned things as well and could check, and they checked in with me about what people found difficult at home, whether it's a section or a particular part of that topic. And then the last one was pupils were given a blank outline, in this case rivers, but we also did it for coasts and for hazards and cyclones and earthquakes. And we just did a retrieval based on lots of questions, and pupils annotated and categorized whether it's a process, a landform, or a management opportunity. And again, this was something that pupils really enjoyed doing, and it was great to see the day of the exam in the canteen, loads of pupils had these out and were testing each other on them. And it was just a big way really of pupils talking about geography and checking their knowledge and having discussions in a interesting and engaging way. If anybody would like any of these templates, or if you'd like me to go for anything more, please just get in touch with me on Twitter. I'll just put my handle just on the front there, and I'm more than willing to share anything, because I appreciate a lot of these things take a long time, and I'm more than willing to swap, share anything. So thank you very much for listening.
Helen, thank you so much, for kind of the time and effort that you've put into that fantastic PowerPoint. I mean, I'm looking at the notes that I've made, and there's so many things that I want to go out and try in the classroom, but also there for your offer of sharing. I mean, it kind of summarises everything what this community is about. So we really do appreciate that, as I'm sure every viewer does as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem at all. Thank you. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the PowerPoint. Lovely. I can see the comments coming up as well. So lovely feedback. So looking next on the PowerPoint, slightly ahead of schedule, we have now got Shiv Das, and he's going to be looking at decolonising geography. So over to you, Shiv. Really looking forward to what you're going to be saying in the next few minutes.
Hi, everyone. So as you know, well, I think I'm maybe the only Scotland teacher up here, so we have a completely different curriculum. So I thought one of the purposes of this presentation would be to just inform people about the drastic changes in education happening in Scotland at the moment through what we call the Hayward Review, which was a review placed by Louise Hayward working in conjunction with Ken Muir about how they wanted to embed sustainability into the curriculum. Basically, the education system needs to find better ways of ensuring that all young people achieve their potential. And perhaps one of the ways of doing this, and is related to the 3 pillars of sustainability, social equity, is through making the geography curriculum, certainly up in Scotland and maybe up down south in England in the national curriculum, more inclusive, more diverse, and essentially speaking, decolonized as well. So decolonizing is about untangling power structures from my reading and from my experience researching the concept and working with other people. So looking at the case studies you teach, for example, Haiti, for example, India, if you're looking at farming changes in India, Rio, for example, in Brazil, and sort of making explicit those links which take place between historical influences and the rates of development, and moving away from a Eurocentric context when looking at, Helen mentioned the Rostow's model earlier, but other models as well, the democratic transition model, and making students and pupils see them in a more critical, through a critical lens. But also diversifying the curriculum as well and improving the representation of people who teach it to sort of reflect the increasingly cosmopolitan society we live in. So how can this be achieved? Well, obviously through a sense of mutual respect and understanding. I'm going to talk a bit about how we up in Scotland have done this within the City of Edinburgh, which is my local authority, but also engaging with exam bodies. Now, up in Scotland, we only have the one exam body, which is called the Scottish Qualifications Authority. I know in England you have multiple exam bodies, which has its advantages. We have a problem at the moment with the SQA and their autonomy over what's going on. So it's about working in cooperation with them, collaborating with them, and making them accountable for what they do. And having CPD, and I'll talk a bit about that later as well. Why? Well, we have a big problem here in Scotland, and that's the lack of diversity in the curriculum. The specifications need massive changes and updating, and learners should be taught to be more critical. There's a disconnect between Scotland years 1 to 3, which is your 11 to 13-year-olds, and then we examine them to hell basically at the end of S4, S5, and S6, which is so there's a huge disconnect, and I'll talk about that in just a wee second. I'm aware of time. I know we've only got 5 minutes. So here are some examples of where you can decolonize or untangle those power relations. Certainly Haiti is a case study taught a lot within the context of hazards. I'm sure a lot of teachers listening and watching this at the moment will have heard of Kelman and his work about are hazards natural. What I like to do, and feel free to just message me on Twitter if you want resources, but what I'd like to do is just have a couple of PowerPoint slides or worksheets or resources on Haiti and the impact of French colonialism, the deforestation that took place, and how that shaped the trajectory of the country. Rio, for example, there's always things about Rio on the news in relation to favelas, but you want to unlock that link between, for example, the 2016 Olympics and the shining the light on the African slave trade and the imperial past. I also like to, when I'm teaching about the Green Revolution within the context of India, teach about the British Raj. I think pupils quite like to, we call them pupils up here, you call them students down in England, but pupils like to, young people like to learn about that. They are engaged. I've got some examples of pupil feedback as well. And then of course the Scramble for Africa, if you're teaching about Congo, you want to be teaching about the Belgian influence. I'm just going to skip a couple of these slides because I'm going to show you exactly what the problem is with the Scottish curriculum at the moment, the SQA courses. So this is the equivalent of GCSE right up here. This is the National 5 geography curriculum, which is it used to be called standard grade and we had intermediate, but you can see basically we've revised the SQA with little consultation, I think, with geography teachers, but sort of categorize it, your usual pigeonhole, physical, human, and global. But there are, I believe, issues with the terminology. I think that's kind of out of date, and the UN have agreed with this as well. We should be looking at different ways we can classify countries. And we're still using developing, developed, third world, second world in certain contexts. So I think we need to move away from that. And the focus should be on sustainability and reducing the development gap. So one of the things which I'm a member of, this is the higher geography. So this is A-level, and you can see there's data terminology, there's out-of-date marking schemes. I mean, and there's certain units which are, I would say, are reinforcing divisions in place. But one of the things we're doing in Scotland, you can see there I've highlighted an example of a mark which you would get in A-level higher SQA geography up in Scotland, which I would debate is not a correct mark. And the reason why is I think it's quite a generalizing comment. Housing in many developing countries is already overcrowded. I think that should be developed, and certainly to achieve that mark. So what we're trying to do in Scotland at the moment is we're trying to reform the geography courses through several working groups, working in consultation with academics, working teachers, curricular reform groups. I'm a member of the geography one, and what we want to do is we want to move away from this physical, human, global division and look more at the themes of geography. So concept, place, sustainability, interconnectedness, diversity. And we've submitted some proposals to the SQA, looking at maybe teaching more about sustainability in the curriculum. So the urban heat island effect, environmental racism, colonization, making that link more explicit, climate injustice, allowing pupils to critically evaluate models. For example, the demographic transition model, the Rostam model. I know Helen mentioned there the Frank's dependency core periphery model, von Neumann's rural, different models we use in geography, and embedding sustainability into the curriculum more thoroughly. So here's some of the feedback we did in Scotland. So interestingly, there wasn't many returns. This is just within the local authority in Edinburgh. But I wanted to find out what people understood by this term decolonization. And there were a few teachers, and they were speaking amongst their faculties and departments. So this is actually probably more feedback than it says there. We're quite unsure about the term. So I believe that the term may, confuse people. They may interpret it as sort of carrying a lot of political baggage. And we want to have more CPD on what that means. Here's some more feedback as well. You can see that sort of half-half when teachers are intentionally representing multiple perspectives and worldviews in their topics. I'll just leave that there for about, and if this is being recorded, you can sort of just stop on that slide and this slide over here. But I would just want to finish off this PowerPoint presentation by showing you a model which I developed in conjunction with the Decolonizing Geography group, led by various really talented and hardworking teachers. I've taken a break from that group at the moment because I've got 2 children under the age of 2. So that's taken a bit of a toll on my personal life. But yeah, and this is very much influenced by Decolonizing Geography, the work of Catherine down south and various other teachers who have been working on this kit, for example. And it's a way of allowing teachers to look at what they're teaching and maybe answer these questions as a faculty. So are they showing a variety of different images in their PowerPoints or resources? Are they including captions in their images, underneath their images as well? So they're not just plunking random images as well. Are they looking at certain terms and looking at the historical context behind them? Are they having those discussions? Are they using up-to-date information? If they're using old atlases or old websites or old textbooks, I wouldn't advocate getting rid of them. I would say look at pupils, maybe with the students, look at how change is taking place over time. I love to have an old atlas in my classroom and allow students to compare, GDP, life expectancy, infant mortality, birth rate over time, get them to do the table and look at those changes taking place over time. I wouldn't advocate banning words either. I would look at kind of the context behind the words we use and whether they're right, whether they're context specific. Drawing links, of course, between colonialism and a location's development. I think you would have to do that in a country like Haiti, Congo, India. Being aware of the different backgrounds of learners in front of you, especially if you teach in classrooms with a variety of different races and backgrounds, and showing a variety of different images and what your own views of the location you're teaching as well. This has really helped me, and I hope this also helps you. I think it's quite a useful slide to maybe have, not quite a useful infographic to have, if you want to call it infographic, by your desk. And different departments have been doing this as well, but also I can send a link to these slides as well. These are different questions which I have developed in relation to different human geography topics, population development and urban rural, because these topics I think are especially in danger of creating stereotypes and misconceptions about other countries. Sorry, that wasn't as well structured as Helen's PowerPoint, but it's Saturday morning. I'm on holiday mode at the moment. But that's
no, Luke, that was absolutely fantastic. Thanks for taking the time. I mean, diversifying the curriculum is, I think we can all agree, absolutely essential in the world that we live in. So I'm just really grateful, really, that you've taken the time to make sure that it's got its slot on our agenda, because I agree it's absolutely pivotal. The other thing that I really took from yours is the concepts. So the idea of geographical concepts underpinning that curriculum and moving away from maybe other thought processes. So thank you. A lot of that resonated with me, as I'm sure it did everyone else. So thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
And if you could share the tweets and use the hashtag, we'd appreciate it as well.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Right then, so next up on the agenda, we have an exciting opportunity for you to pilot, review, and also give some feedback on a new product that's out there, which is going to be focusing on geography. So we're going to leave the QR image on the screen for about 2 or 3 minutes, just for you to kind of use it and have a go at piloting and giving a little bit of feedback and seeing if any of those new resources could benefit you in your classrooms. Brilliant. Hopefully you've really enjoyed those new resources and will be something to consider in the future. So the time is now 10:30. So that means we are very excited to welcome our next speaker, Deepo Falayan, who is going to be speaking about his book, Africa is Not a Country. I, for one, Deepo, am so excited to hear about what you've got to say. So over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I've spent sort of a lot of the last year and a half really being embraced by the geography community, teachers and schools, and it's been such a privilege kind of seeing a lot of my work go out there through sort of education, and that's something that means a lot to me. So I'm always thrilled when I get invited to do these things, and it's really great to follow Helen and Shiv's talks this morning. I think Shiv in particular, there are sort of a lot of overlapping themes that I'll touch on, but it's not going to surprise anyone that my focus today is going to be on Africa in particular, and the work that I'm doing specifically in trying to break the stereotypes that have been passed on from generation to generation. And I think that a key part of that work is work that geography teachers in particular can do to ensure that generations coming up and young people across the country understand where these stereotypes have come from, and how context and history and geography and the accurate teaching of these things when it comes to Africa can really play a big difference in crushing many of these stereotypes. So the first thing I think is important to do is to address some of those stereotypes head on. One thing I find is that when you ask most people to think about Africa, they think about one of two things only: poverty and safari, and nothing else. And for me, that's an incredibly painful thing, because when I think about the continent, I think about diversity. I think in particular about my own country, Nigeria, and just how many different experiences and histories and traditions exist in this one place alone. I think about the fact that we are a country of 200 million people, of about 500 different languages, and just that alone has anyone realizing just how diverse this one country alone is. When I say 500 languages, often young students sort of squeal in shock, and it is a surprising, in many ways, a figure that is worthy of shock. And I think that is at the heart of why I think about diversity when I think about Africa. Because if you expand that from just one country into 54 countries and 1.4 billion people, then you start to really picture just how diverse this region is. And you start to really wonder why it is that when people think about the continent around the world, they only think about poverty and destruction and chaos. And they don't understand the realities of what actually exists in the region, and the history of the region, and the history of how these individual countries were formed. So to get to the formation of these countries, you first have to, of course, embrace colonialism. And the way I sort of break it up when I talk about Africa and its history is starting from what is essentially point A, which is the Berlin Conference of the 1890s. And the Berlin Conference is an event that most people around the world know nothing about, and which is, again, particularly shocking to me, since it is arguably the most important singular event that has ever occurred to modern Africa. And the Berlin Conference, I'm sure people here, many people here know, but to get into a bit more detail about it and why it matters when we move on later on to talk about the formation of these countries, is because at this conference, a certain narrative was created. And what initially preceded this conference was many of these men who you see here, they represent the main colonial powers of the day. So Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the United States, Belgium. They gathered here after sending explorers into the region. This particular depiction of it, you can see the giant map of Africa in the top of the picture. And they had sent explorers into the region, and these explorers came back and told them stories that said that Africa was a wonderful place, that it was full of incredible natural resources and people and communities that were as technologically advanced as anywhere else in the world. And what these men decided to do, as we all understand, is they decided to steal this land for themselves. And the first thing they wanted to sort of sort out was what they would tell the rest of the world. Because at that time, back in the 1890s, as it is today, it was illegal to colonize another person's land. And so they needed to come up with a justification. And so they came up with a myth that has survived till today. And that myth said that Africa was a region full of savages and uncivilized people, that it was full of people who couldn't look after themselves. And what they needed was that they needed the Western powers to come in and introduce what they called the 3 C's, which was commerce, Christianity, and civilization. And after agreeing on this myth, because they knew it was a myth based on the information that had come back to them from the explorers, they set about creating basically a rule book on how they were going to carve up this piece of land. And that rule book basically said that the first country to reach a piece of land essentially plant a flag there and then force the local population under their will could have that piece of land. Now, as you can imagine, forcing the people under your will involved an incredible amount of violence. And that was essentially it. That was the rules that were set out. There was very little care for the lives of the people who lived in the continent. There was little care for the histories that existed there, the architects, the painters, the teachers, the students, people who had built their lives there in their communities for generations and generations. It was entirely up to you as a colonial power to decide what was best for your country, how best you could extract as many natural resources as possible. And so this was what led to what we now know as the Scramble for Africa and the creation of what we see here, which is essentially the map of modern Africa. There are a couple of countries missing from this map, but we can get to that later. What is key in understanding first is that many of these countries did not exist before the Berlin Conference. These countries were an invention of the colonialists. And this is where the geography of the region plays a huge role in exactly how these nations have been able to grow and develop up until today. And so after they'd agreed on the myth, and after they agreed on it being their right to go in and take the land, and they agreed on a central set of rules, they set off to conquer chunks of land. These chunks of land represent the pieces of territory that each region had taken for themselves, and very little of it makes any sense. It was never really meant to make any sense for the people who lived in the region themselves. I'll give you an example of just how devastating and destructive this process of colonization was. We'll take the first country that was created after the Berlin Conference, which was the Democratic Republic of Congo. But it wasn't known as Democratic Republic of Congo then. It was called the Congo Free State. It was called that by the then King of Belgium, King Leopold II. King Leopold wanted a piece of land for himself, and so he decided to basically petition the other colonial powers and the Belgian government to give him a large chunk of Central Africa that we can see right there in the center of the map. And King Leopold wanted this land because he didn't have many responsibilities back in Belgium. And he wanted to prove that he could take on these sort of responsibilities. And so the rest of the colonial powers, who didn't really know much about this piece of land, decided to give it to him. Now, this large country, as we know, did not exist before the Berlin Conference. What existed looked something like this. Now, overlaid on this map, which I find to be a really, really useful tool, were the communities that existed before the Berlin Conference and how they existed. Each different color represents a different community. And on top of it, overlaid, you can see what are now the borders of Africa, of African countries. Now, if we go back, I hope everyone's kind of spotted the Democratic Republic of Congo in the middle, you can see all the many different ethnic groups that existed in that region before the Berlin Conference. They were to continue to exist, but they were forced to be a part of one country by a man who had never been to Africa before, let alone been to that region of Central Africa. He had just heard from his explorers that it was full of incredible resources that would be worthwhile for the Belgians to have. Now, one of the things that King Leopold hadn't thought about was just how expensive it would be to run this piece of land. And the Belgian government didn't realize how expensive it would be either. And so very quickly, as it got more and more expensive, the Belgian government gave him a warning. And they said to him that either You find a way of making money from this piece of land, or we're going to have to take it off you. And so King Leopold turned to slavery, turned to turning the people, the previously free people of this region, who had existed within their ethnic groups happily for generations and generations, into slaves. And their specific job was to feed the growing Thai population. And to do that, they had to extract rubber from vines, which was an incredibly painful process of slicing into vines, having the rubber extract splurt out onto your skin. You then would have to peel it off. And as you can imagine, that was incredibly painful. Now, for many of these people, they had never experienced anything like this before. And it got worse and worse as his reign continued, because he was never, as far as the Belgian government were concerned, ever making enough money. So the more money they needed, the more people were put to work as slaves. Anybody who refused to work was killed. Anybody who didn't work fast enough was also killed. And as a result, we had one of the most brutal regimes in the history of the world. By the time King Leopold left the Congo Free State, about half the population had been killed directly as a result of his reign. Now that is about 10 million people. Now that is the birth of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The systematic killing through slavery of 10 million people. That was how this country was physically formed and created. Those ethnic groups had survived for years and years, and suddenly they were forced to be a part of a country that they didn't want to be a part of, but not only that, were then forced to make money for a man thousands of miles away. This fundamentally is the formation of many of these African countries. All the other colonialists had heard about what was happening, but they decided that it was within their right and that what they wanted to do was take as many natural resources as possible. Let's take another example of a country that I mentioned earlier, Nigeria. Let's just go back to make sure everyone spots Nigeria over in West Africa. And now let's zoom in a bit more. And you can see, similarly to what we talked about earlier, a nation made up of lots and lots of different ethnic groups. As I said earlier, when I started this discussion, that Nigeria is a country of about 500 languages. Now, of course, having a country of 500 languages isn't ideal, but it wasn't meant to be ideal. The British wanted to create large countries that were full of lots and lots of different languages because it would make it hard for the people to come together and to fight back against the colonialists. So they created countries through their geography that were full of tension. And that tension was done by forcing ethnic groups, many of which had a history of going to war with each other, worshipped different gods, had different histories, different traditions, forced them to be a part of these nations. Nations that completely went against their histories. And Nigeria is an example of that. The hope was that these ethnic groups would turn against each other before they would agree to turn against the British. These nations were built through their geography essentially to fail. They were not meant to succeed. They were meant to be as difficult and as challenging as possible for the local populations, so that while the local populations tried to get their act together, the colonial powers could spend that time taking out as many natural resources as possible. And Nigeria is a country that really struggled with a lot of that geography. A nation of 200 million people today, split 50% Muslim, 50% Christian, split up between ethnic groups, split up with traditions, many of their natural resources, their artifacts stripped out of the country. Another key indicator of the damage that was caused by the geography that was instilled by the colonialists is the borders in Africa. As people can easily spot about these borders, many of them are just straight lines. About 30% of all the borders in Africa are just straight lines. And as you can see, again, why I particularly like this map is you can see how many of these straight lines cut through, right through the middle of ethnic groups and cultures. Many of the colonialists had never really stepped foot in Africa. They didn't take the time to traverse all of the land. The carving up of countries and of territory was incredibly crude. In the book, I go into a bit more detail about how exactly that was done and how the flag planting worked. But as we can see from the map, we can see the results of that. We can see the way communities were split in some cases between 4 countries. And you can imagine the devastating impact that had on the traditions of those countries. The impact that that had on the peace that these new nations could get out of these nations, because it would be incredibly difficult to find a semblance of national unity when you had communities and ethnic groups split between countries, feeling incredibly frustrated by what was happening. We see this not only in the way in which the borders were placed on the continent, but also in areas in which there technically are no borders at all. And in those cases, we have what the colonialists tried to do was instill natural borders without really understanding how many of those natural borders worked. In some cases, they were rivers. I'll read a short passage from the book to give you a sense of just how challenging that could be in some places. Uganda and the DRC share a border, part of which is meant to be delineated by the Semleki River, which flows from Lake Albert to Lake Edward. That's fine until the river changes direction, of course. And thanks to global warming, melting nearby mountain snow caps, the Semleki has shifted its course 100 times in the past 6 decades alone. We never had an official boundary, the Uganda's Minister of Energy and Ministry told The Independent back in 2009. The colonialists just said, use the river, and that is what we had always gone with. Communities that live near the river have switched over time from being Ugandan to Congolese and back again, because of a decision made by the Belgians over a century ago. The border also cuts through Lake Albert. Oil has been discovered under Lake Albert. So it's not hard to imagine what happened after a treasured resource was found near a mythical water border. Both countries, as anyone would, claimed it for their own. An enduring conflict erupted along the fishing lands under the Albert. That is replicated across much of the continent. The same thing can be seen in Nigeria and Cameroon, where both countries are meant to share a border that's been split by the Akwafe River, which you can see on the map. That has caused many countries to genuinely not even know where one country begins and another country ends. That has made it hard for these nations to be stable. That has created conflict between countries. In the book, I mention how only 30% of all borders in the world are in Africa, yet nearly 60% of all territorial disputes that have made it to the International Court of Justice come from the continent, fueling a similar tension between many of these nations. These countries, through their geographies, were built to fail. Ethnic groups were forced together, and very little of this is known around the world. Throughout the colonial period, many of these countries were trying to raise the alarm, but many of the nations around the world had come to believe the myth that was created at the Berlin Conference, that Africans were savages, that they were uncivilized people who couldn't look after themselves, who needed the intervention from the West to save them. And as the rest of the world heard about the simmering tensions that existed across Africa, they didn't know that a lot of that was deliberately introduced into the continent. They didn't know about the Congo Free State. They didn't know about the way ethnic groups were forced to come together to be a part of incredibly large countries that they didn't want to be a part of. They didn't know about Britain's divide and rule policies that deliberately pitted ethnic groups against each other. They couldn't fully grasp the fact that many of these countries were full of hundreds of different languages, dozens and dozens of different religions and traditions. They didn't know that these countries were being built to fail. They weren't taking seriously the borders in the region. didn't ask enough questions about why these borders were so straight and what the impact of these straight borders were. They didn't know that communities and ethnic groups were being split across multiple countries, and how those communities were trying to fight to return to how they previously were. They didn't know about the natural land borders that made little sense. How many of the explorers that the colonialists had sent hadn't actually bothered to go and inspect the land for themselves. They simply just put down flags on a map and took charge of the region. Previously free people suddenly run under the thumb of colonialists who knew nothing about their traditions and frankly didn't care. The aim was to build and create countries that had no chance of survival. That's why the geography of these nations is so important. It adds the missing context that is often ignored when we talk about Africa. It adds the important history and how many of these countries and what they're facing today is not by their own making. Colonialism is key to the realities of this nation and the chaos that was introduced. In the beginning, we talked about how this map doesn't include a couple of countries, and one of the countries many people will spot haven't been included is South Sudan. And South Sudan is a perfect example of a nation that couldn't live with the tensions that were introduced to them, the ethnic divisions, the geography of their region. It didn't work for them, and they decided to split and form another country. And that has been an incredibly difficult thing. It hasn't been easy. A lot of that tension that took decades to create still existed. And it existed for most countries who eventually were able to fight for independence and gain it in the 1960s. Unlike Sudan, many countries have decided that it just wouldn't be worth the hassle to try and redraw these borders. It was the first thing that came up after the independence era when the majority of countries met at what was essentially the formation of the African Union. They discussed whether it was the right thing to do to just reject the borders that had been forced upon us throughout colonialism and start to draw the map again. But the issue was that it was the 1960s and the rest of the world was moving on. And it had taken decades for these maps to be created in the first place, and they knew that it would take decades and decades for the redrawing of all these borders. And that wouldn't even touch on all the realities of fighting for the natural resources and which countries would get what, which ethnic groups could hold on to what. And so many of these countries decided to stick with what they had. And that was a difficult decision because, as we understand, these countries were not meant to succeed on their own. They'd been created in a way that would ensure that they would crumble. And it wasn't easy in those first few years. Many of these nations struggled to come together across all these different ethnic groups and all these different languages and all these different religions to find a common sense of national identity, to find a common purpose, to do the things that you do when you create a new country, to develop a national language, to develop things like a national anthem, for example, a school curriculum, what to focus on, what not to focus on, constitutions, whether to develop rules and laws based on a particular religion or not. And so you had the civil wars of the 1960s and 1970s. But many of these countries have been able to come through that. The vast majority, in fact, have been able to come through that. They've been able to overcome their geographies today to create stable nations. Nations in which over 90% across Africa are now under some form of democratic rule. They were able to overcome the challenges that they had inherited, the cards that they'd been forcibly dealt, to build something that actually has come to contribute so much to the rest of the world through culture and politics and music and art. But they've done that in the face of this nagging stereotype that has existed up until today. They've done so despite the fact that many people around the world still see the continent as a place of suffering and nothing else. Many countries, after they were able to get through those early years, have wanted many nations and people from across the world to come and visit them, to contribute to their tourism. But they've struggled to do that because that myth has endured up until today. Why would you want to visit a country, a continent, a region that you're being told is ravaged by poverty and pain and destruction? More and more generations have grown up not understanding the geography of the region, understanding that the challenges that they read about and they often hear about were not the fault of those who actually live there, but were deliberately introduced to the region to make it easier for colonialists to steal the land and to steal the natural resources and to take for as long as possible. They don't know about the Congo Free State and the ethnic groups and the way they were put together and the borders and the fights and disputes over where one country begins and one country ends. A lot of those myths have continued to be carried through charity campaigns that have pushed certain imagery, the sort of images that we see here, images of starving children, destitute mothers, the sort of images that were pushed by campaigns like Do They Know It's Christmas? That projected an Africa in which there was no running water, in which the only hope that people could have every year is to stay alive. The only gift that people give each other is often hopeless. That is the danger of a single story. That is the danger of these stereotypes and the way they've been able to survive. But I know and I believe that we can flip that narrative and we can tell a more realistic story. Because this isn't just the history of Africa. For me, it's the history of the whole world. This continent has contributed an incredible amount to the United Kingdom through all sorts, whether it's through art, music, fashion, politics. Colonialism and the British Empire is very much the history of the United Kingdom as much as it is the history of Nigeria or Ghana or Guinea-Bissau or Rwanda, which is why for me it is so essential that we ensure that more generations don't grow up believing in this myth. And the most effective way of doing that, I believe, is through education and through schools, of teaching the history of colonialism, the history of these countries, the political history, the cultural history, but also at its core, the geography of these regions. That tells the fullest story of what happened to these countries, to these people, to these communities and these ethnic groups across the region. And my hope is that if we do that and we teach more accurately exactly how these countries were formed and why they were formed the way that they were formed, then I think that we can ensure that generations don't continue to grow up thinking about Africa only being good for poverty and safari and nothing else. But that people start to see the continent the way that I see the continent, through its diversity. They start to think about the region and think about just how incredible it has been for many of these countries to overcome the hands that they were dealt. These countries were built to fail. And so many people across the continent, despite their history and despite the geography, have ensured that their nations haven't failed, but instead are standing incredibly strong. Just 60 years after independence, countries that are younger than my parents are have been able to overcome these challenges. And I hope that all of you will join me in this effort into breaking these stereotypes through the teaching of geography. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deepo. That was a fantastic summary of a really complex history that I think that we've all been kind of drawn to those most important key points that will shape our own practice. We've now got just under 10 minutes for questions. So for all of our kind of viewers watching, if you've got any questions for Deepo, if you could just type them in the chat and I can read them out, and hopefully Deepo will have some time to answer them. And just while you're thinking of them, I've just got a couple if that's okay. For the English National Curriculum, it states kind of that a Key Stage 3 region of Africa is advised to be used to study kind of human and physical processes. Now, I think number one should be the moral purpose, as you've kind of eloquently said throughout that half an hour kind of time slot. It's absolutely fundamental that young people kind of learn the lessons of the history of Africa, but wider the world. But do you think there's a specific region that geography teachers could be focusing on or making kind of more references to within the continent of Africa that's most effective at breaking the stereotypes?
Yeah, so I think you know, in the book, I think you know, the West Africa as a region is particularly fascinating in terms of the way in which these countries, the specific sort of policies of the British and the specific chaos that was introduced in those regions. I think that particular region is fascinating when you read about you know, just how much they've had to overcome in terms of the way in which they were set up, the divide and rule policies. In the book, I talk about the creation of you know, what is sort of colloquially known as big men, which are these sort of, you know, the British empowered these corrupt individuals, gave them money and arms and guns, and they would essentially be those early year dictators that countries found incredibly difficult to shift, but they did. But I think that, you know, there is, in terms of the geography of West Africa as well, but also examples of, you know, countries like Botswana that were genuinely left alone during colonialism because, you know, they were not really seen as having much, but a lot of their natural riches have been discovered after colonialism, and you can sort of see how the nations that were left alone and, you know, largely left alone and have been able to harness their natural resources on their own have enjoyed a huge amount of success since colonialism left the rest of the region. So that is an example of, for people who kind of look at Africa and think of Africans as, oh, there's just something fundamentally wrong with Africans. You kind of see the dichotomy between the success of nations like Botswana, who were essentially left alone.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Just while you're speaking, then a few comments came in. So the first question is from Catherine, who has asked, what would you say is the biggest success story in Africa?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think it's often kind of very complicated and it's often personal necessarily to people's individual experiences. You can look at you know, the countries that had to overcome the most involvement in them. So, you know, nations like the bigger nations like Nigeria, for example, South Africa, Kenya, you know, who had to deal with a lot of personal individual challenges. You can look at countries like Rwanda, for example, who fought an incredibly bloody civil war. And, you know, what was essentially a genocide, and the way in which they've been able to recover from that to find a semblance of peace across ethnic groups. So I think I would find it hard to kind of pinpoint one specific success story, but I think in understanding the history of the region, you start to really pick up on a multitude of stories of countries that have been able to overcome very challenging origins.
Brilliant, thank you. The second question would be, how are the issues of European colonialism dealt with in schools in African countries that you're most familiar with? And that's from Alistair.
Yeah, so in the countries that I'm most familiar with, it's been again, a lot of this history is very recent. And in one of the sort of negative impacts of the recency of colonialism and the challenges that many of these countries faced in the early years after independence was, as part of the sort of peace and reconciliation efforts after their civil wars, was to essentially not talk about what had happened. And with many of the individuals who had been a part of some of the worst instances of sort of violence very much still alive and knocking about, Africa as a region in which many of our country's founding fathers are still essentially, still alive, in some cases still fighting for power. And so, a lot of that has been avoided in schools as part of a way to just, forgive and forget. But a lot of that is changing now. And in the past decade, we've seen a lot of countries try and not only ensure that, their young people are being educated on these histories and are visiting sites, and a lot more money is being put into it, but also they're trying to push that message internationally as well. And there are countries that want to tell their own stories and are encouraging people not only to come to their countries to tell their stories, but also it's important as well in this conversation around national artifacts that are being hoarded and kept outside of the continent, that they are finding it harder and harder to tell these stories because many of these artifacts they don't have access to. In the book, I talk about how 90% of all of Africa's cultural legacy is being held in museums and university and in private collections outside of the continent. And so this is, all of this is part of that wider discussion around colonialism and the continued impacts it has.
Lovely, a great answer, Deepa. And I think it's given us a lot of kind of food for thought surrounding what narratives are we going to prioritise in kind of putting in our curriculums, and what perspectives are we going to be changing. So the artifacts one is, I think, a fantastic example that you discuss in your book, that we should be telling that story and making pupils aware of. Thank you. There's one more question for Catherine. So, and this is to do with link schools. So Catherine says, are link schools in Uganda, it's on the screen now, hopefully, have homophobia embedded in their systems? If I say this is wrong to my Ugandan colleagues, I feel like I'm undermining their culture, but I also can't accept homophobia. I also recognise that homophobia is rooted in their colonial experience. Have you got any advice for tackling that?
So again, this is something that should be taught in school as well. A lot of these anti-gay laws that we see across the continent were laws that were specifically introduced during colonialism. These are colonial era laws that didn't exist before the colonialists. So, homophobia is something that was introduced by a lot of missionaries and the colonialists. So, my advice when talking about this often is just to raise that, to talk about it in the context of this was another thing that was introduced into the region, into many countries through colonialism. And I think seeing it's not so much rooted in the traditions of many of these cultures. It's something that is relatively recent to a lot of these countries, and it was done through colonialism. So I would sort of, instead of framing it as an attack on the current government or whatever they're doing now, just use that as another educational tool to talk about how many of these anti-gay laws are essentially colonial era laws that were introduced through missionaries.
An excellent question, Catherine. Thanks for typing that into the chat, and Deepa, thank you for responding to it as articulately as you did. And it's now 11:10 nearly, so thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Right then, so moving on to our next speaker. And thank you all just for really engaging. I'm just reading the comments as they were coming through while Deepa was speaking. And it's great to see that you're all kind of taking a lot from Deepa's and the other speaker sessions. So keep posting any kind of questions or comments that you might have in that chat. So 11:10, we have now got Alex Farnfield, who is going to be delivering her session on using Mode B to improve explanation. So over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Gemma. Some really big shoes to fill there. So thank you to Deepa as well. So I'm going to be talking a bit today about using Mode B to aid student explanation. And this is based on the concept of Mode B from Tom Sherrington in his books as well. So Mode B, what is it and the rationale behind it? So Mode B is those awe and wonder inspiring activities. Often they're seen as the fun things that students get to do, but they are actually really vital to the curriculum and giving students to make those hands-on experiences, develop their ideas, and are vital opportunities to build on foundational knowledge. They help students in supporting they help students understand complex abstract concepts and actually give them that real life experience to try and actually visualize what they're talking about. However, the key thing with this is that they can become gimmicky. And if students are just doing something, they come up and go, oh, miss, I really like that lesson with cake, but I can't actually tell you anything that we did with it. Or they can't actually explain the concept or the knowledge behind it. So a couple of different areas of Mode B. So we can use experiments, so doing something where actually students are visualising the change in, for example, percolation rates, creating models, using self-directed learning, where each student will maybe research something, giving a success criteria and having that debate using it. Debate and talk for writing are also really good forms of Mode B to support those students in their understanding, and collaborative learning as well. Now, part of my CPD drive this year has been to really focus on trying to implement these and really evaluate it. And one of the things I have found is that if students don't have that key foundational knowledge beforehand, it is 10 times harder for them to actually use it afterwards. So it isn't just a case of modelling cave arch stack stump with an angel cake if they don't have the knowledge of that process first. If that is the first time they are interacting with those concepts, they are not going to develop what they need to be able to explain it afterwards. So if students do not use what they've just done, the activity will completely run the risk of just being a gimmick. The follow-up is almost as important, if not more, than the task design itself. So whatever students have done, the follow-up has to include some sort of explanation. And actually this experience can really help aid that explanation. It's something we all say, especially at GCSE, that it's making sure students are developing that explanation, the reasons why. But if they've just done an activity and then 3 weeks later they're talking about it and they can't actually explain the stages, it's not going to be worthwhile. So how does each activity actually develop their geographical understanding, and then how can they go forward and use that in their explanation? So I've got a couple of examples, see how many we get through. So first of all is coastal landforms, and this is one that I did with an arch cave stack stump. And students, first of all, had a go at looking at real life landforms, Dale Door, etc. And they had a go at creating their model. They then used a formation diagram and actually improved their models using that, labelled where the erosion had occurred, what types of erosion, so on. This was with year 8 as well, so it was quite a high and aspirational thing for them to do. And then they add annotations to explain each change. Now, before that, they'd had a lot of lessons on types of erosion and how they change, so that this really helped them to actually visualise those. But then following that, students were able to really improve their explanation of how erosion shapes the coastline. By actually using the model in front of them, they had a better logical step-by-step process of what was going on, rather than just rushing through. Another one is using the DTM, which is a bit more of a hands-on and collaborative learning approach. So where students, first of all, again, this has come with a large foundational teaching of what a DTM is and what changes they'd expect to see. Students were then given data for a population pyramid to create, and then they decided what order to go into and what stage and why. Again, by doing that, they had a better foundational knowledge of explaining the changes and why, because they'd had that exploration chance. I've got another one there, but I will leave it at that just because I'm short on time. But I will leave that one up there, and I will share these slides as well. But with all of these, it is that I found that they've been really, really useful to help students explain step by step and go further in depth into that explanation. So I would love to see some examples of if you do try any Mode B, so please do tag me on Twitter as well. But it's something I found really, really useful, so I'd love to hear what you think as well.
Alex, that was great. Thank you so much. Again, another tangible strategy that people can go out and have a go at in the classrooms. I think your first example about kind of coastal formation is an apt one, because I know for one, pupils, from my experience, really struggle with that sequencing at times. So I think Mode B will really help with that kind of thought process, as you said. So thanks so much for taking the time and presenting to all of us.
Lovely. Thank you, Gemma.
No, thank you. Have a good day. Right then, so up next we've got Sam Dobby, and just to let you know that after Sam Dobby we're going to have a little bit of a change of order, and we're going to be hearing from Melanie from Oxford University Press. So first up we're going to have Sam. So if Sam's available, Sam's going to be looking at bringing cutting edge climate change research into your classroom. So over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gemma. Yeah, so my name's Sam. My background is in teaching, but at the moment I'm working with a university to try and think of ways that we can bring kind of real world climate change research into our classrooms. So just a little bit of background then. Within the higher education sector, there's this growing concern that knowledge about trees and plants and forests, as well as uptake on these kind of degree programs, is diminishing. But as Shiv mentioned earlier, there's this growing recognition within the secondary school sector that these topics such as sustainability and climate change really need to be embedded into our teaching. And I'm sure everyone here, we're all well aware that kind of climate change and sustainability is already within the curriculum and it is within our specifications. But for some reason, it's just not kind of starting to stick and it's not following through to university. So the aim of my talk today is to think of some strategies that you could perhaps use in your own classrooms to start bringing in real world climate change research to help bridge that gap. So the first one then, a little bit outside the box perhaps, but it's thinking about actually bringing in that real world climate change research into your classroom by actually taking your pupils outside of the classroom and visiting some of these experiments that are actually happening at the moment. So I'm not going to read this definition out because learning outside the classroom, it's relatively straightforward, but it's that idea of bringing in these enriching experiences, a bit similar perhaps to the Mode B that Alex has just been talking about, and kind of really bringing these topics to life so that your students can see those real world applications. So one place that you might consider visiting is the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research and their By4 FACE facility. So FACE stands for Free Air Carbon Enrichment, and it's a woodland that you can see here that's located in Staffordshire, about an hour just outside of Birmingham. And if you look carefully, you'll notice there's rings, and those rings are called arrays. And it's called Free Air Carbon Enrichment because if you notice there's little masts, and next to those, if you look really, really carefully, there's kind of black drain pipes that have holes in. And what scientists are doing, they're actually pushing out carbon through these so that little pockets of the woodland are getting an elevated amount of carbon. And they're increasing it by about 150 parts per million above ambient, so above the carbon levels for that given day. And the reason they're doing that is because it takes us to what we expect by 2050, and it gives us a really good chance of seeing actually what is exactly going to happen to that whole ecosystem. So obviously, this is part of a whole network as well, which is quite exciting. So we're just one experiment. There's one that's happening in Australia called Eucalyptus because it's mostly eucalyptus. And then another one that's happening over in Brazil that's just being built, which is really exciting because it has that global kind of network then as well. But as Catherine has just mentioned in the chat, we need to consider the benefits and also the barriers. So if we have a little think then, what are the benefits of actually taking your students out of the classroom to visit some of these climate change experiments then? Well, a little bit Blue Peter style, I actually asked this to some PGCE students, and these are the answers that they gave. Some of them might be similar to the ones that you were thinking of. So it's fun, it's engaging, it kind of develops social skills, it really brings that real world life kind of application of geography, to the pupils, and they get to see it happening in the real world, and it's a really good experience for them to be able to take back to their classrooms. And this tallies up with the research then. So studies have shown that it kind of helps open their eyes up to the world around them. And it also enhances academic attainment. But again, it also supports that health and well-being element as well, and developing those spiritual, moral, social and cultural needs too. But as I said, we also need to consider the barriers to that then. So I asked again my PGCE students what they thought the barriers would be to kind of visiting a place like By Full Face. And these are the things that they came up with. So as you can see, money, access, time, costs, cover, all of these things are going to prevent you from being able to actually go out of your classrooms and visit these amazing research facilities. And a big one here is, of course, health and safety and risk assessments and things like that too. So what you could do instead then perhaps is have a virtual field trip. So one of the silver linings perhaps of the pandemic is that there's actually an amazing amount of virtual field trips that you can find online, and you can allow your students to actually visit and explore that facility themselves, taking self-guided walks of these kind of experiments. And there are ways that you can bring that into your kind of teaching time by thinking of how you could link it up to the curriculum for Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 5, and using different tasks like escape room tasks and things like that to really get them working together and engaging with that online kind of virtual tour as well. Another thing that is really, really cool to bring into your classrooms is citizen science. So this is how you can actually do some field work, but actually on your school site, which obviously is going to reduce the need to be doing your risk assessments. And at By Full, we have these dendrometer bands, which you can install, which are kind of tree rings. So using a spring and a bit of metal, you can actually develop your own dendrometer band and watch your trees grow. And the really key point here is that trees are an amazing vehicle for topics like the carbon cycle and also the water cycle and the links between them. So it's really kind of helping to contextualize those topics that sometimes can be a little bit tricky to teach, and giving them those hands-on experiences as well. So the really cool thing is that these dendrometer bands actually link back to real-world research, which a lot of citizen science projects also do. And it is kind of pushing that point that this is real world, it's things that are actually happening, and it's a way that scientists are actually contributing to our understanding of climate change. And it's fantastic that pupils can get involved with that as well. So one way that you can actually bring that into your lessons though, so you're not just standing out in the field hoping it's not going to rain, is actually thinking about using these citizen science projects as a way of modelling how you might plan or develop field work, and encouraging your pupils to develop their own research questions, so nice inquiry-led learning, as well as actually getting your pupils to do those risk assessments for you. So giving them the tools and the ideas and the methods, and then really getting them to think about what the risks and the hazards are associated with that fieldwork. So the final thing I was going to talk about was actually another way that you can bring in climate change research into your classroom is thinking about the careers aspect. So thinking about how pupils can get involved in the future really kind of helps them get motivated with this topic. So using real world profiles of PhD students, perhaps like Manon here, but also kind of people that get involved with the wider project. So we've got our technical assistant here, Esther, as well. So I think I've got about a minute left, so I'm just going to move on to my summary slide. So today I've talked about 4 different ways that you might kind of use real world research to bring in the climate change topics to your lessons and really make it super engaging as well. So thank you.
Sam, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. So many great ideas that we can kind of think about and think how we can include in our curriculums. And especially thank you for acknowledging those barriers. Cost, time, money is kind of a lot of things that we have to consider. So the virtual elements in on the on-site field work is so beneficial for us to be thinking about as well. I'm Birmingham based, so I will be striving for the first one as well. But yes, thank you so much. And thanks for all the comments that I'm sure you can read through now. Right then, so it's 11:25, so we are now on Melanie from Oxford University Press, so one of our sponsors. So thank you very much, Melanie, for your time today. Over to you.
Hi. I can't see my screen. Oh, there it is. Okay. Don't panic. Right. Hello there, everyone. I'm the local rep for OUP, and my job is visiting schools in the Northwest, covering Cheshire, Stockport, Merseyside and Shropshire. When I realised I was going to be presenting virtually today, I must admit I was feeling a bit daunted, but after consulting with colleagues, I was repeatedly assured that there was nothing to worry about, as the delegates would treat my presentation as an ad break and would have rushed into their kitchens to make bacon sandwiches or watch a bit of Wimbledon. So I do hope some of you are still here, and I'm just going to run through some of our existing publishing updates and would like to introduce our brand new revision series at the end. Okay. So I'm starting with a quick update on Key Stage 3. Jog.123 has been updated for all 3 year groups and is currently in a 5th edition. The whole series has been checked for diversity and inclusion, and it's still known as one of the most accessible courses for all abilities. And don't forget, we have workbooks which are ideal for homework and intervention. The matching online resources on Caboodle are very engaging, with lovely animations and videos and interactive activities and differentiated worksheets, as well as a focus on developing geography skills for GCSE. We do have a special Caboodle bundle price for all 3 year groups. So if you would like to update your Jog.123 books to the most current edition, then this is the best way to do it. Contact us on the QR code link if you would like a free trial until September. Another option for Key Stage 3 is this resource, specially written to support schools teaching the AQA spec at GCSE. This is liked by schools who are looking to stretch students, and there is a real focus on geographical skills on the Caboodle, including a teacher book with digital links. This slide shows the 3 GCSE options we publish for Edexcel, AQA and OCR. We now have a brand new 2nd edition for AQA, and the Edexcel 2nd editions are due to publish this month. And these have been written following recent exam board feedback. So there are new activities and questions reflecting the wording in recent exam papers, updated case studies and examples, facts and figures updated, enhanced D&I check. And as with Jog.123, if you're looking to update your student books, then the Caboodle bundle subscription could be a good option for you. The Caboodle would give you student and teacher access to the brand new 2nd edition student book, the teacher handbook, and a variety of interactive resources, quizzes, study guides, online auto-marked quizzes, and access to 3 exam practice papers with marked schemes. We also publish A-level geography resources for Edexcel and AQA, and these have a student book for each year and revision guides that exactly match the student books, summarising the content from a double-page spread to a single page. And the exam practice workbooks have detailed guidance on answering all types of exam questions. They're in full colour, and the school price is discounted by 40% all year round. And we do have Caboodle for A-Level 2 with contents very similar to GCSE, and they're ideal for independent learning. So let us know if you would like to trial them before September. Just use the QR codes, which are on this next slide here. So finally, I would like to introduce our new revision series. Oxford Revise is a standalone resource not linked to our existing publishing, combining revision and practice all in one book. We are publishing for a variety of subjects across the curriculum, including AQA, Edexcel and OCR for geography. This series has just been introduced this month, and it's a brand new concept in revision based on metacognition. So we give students the method for learning based on knowledge retrieval and practice, a familiar theme in schools at the moment. with everything they need all in one book. The pages are well designed, in full colour, with everything in a clear, logical place, designed to avoid cognitive overload and provide a revision method that works. There are QR codes in all the chapters that link to sample answers and mark schemes for all the exam style questions, plus key terms glossaries, GCSE exam papers and revision tips. Oxford Revised revision guides are also environmentally friendly. They are made in the UK and printed on FSC certified paper using vegetable-based inks. They are very competitively priced at just £5.50 each. We're sending these out free of charge to all schools at the moment, so please register on the QR codes to make sure you get your copy. So that's it from me. Welcome back to all the people who've been in the kitchen. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Melanie, can I ask a favour just while Gemma is chatting to you? Can you move your slide back to the one with the QR codes?
Oh, yes, that's a very good idea. Right,
so if you just go back, I think it was slide 6 or 7. One more.
There we go.
There we go. That's
just leave that on screen for a minute so then people can access it.
Thanks.
There we go. So the links and the QR codes are there. But yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. Those revision guides look superb. So thank you for drawing our attention to those, as well as all the textbooks. I don't know whether you had a chance to see the comments coming in, but somebody had a delivery of Jog 1, 2, 3 last night. So they're spending today looking at them. They're great. And somebody else has just commented on the screen saying just got a sample sent through and they look good. So you got some great multitasking. There we go. But yeah, hopefully everybody can use the QR codes now. Everybody who wants them. Fingers crossed. Well, we've got your slide anyway, I believe, so we can send those out if need be. But thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Right then, so 11:33. So we've just heard from Melanie for OUP. So we are now very excited to welcome Chris Gregory, who's going to be looking at mini inquiry questions to sequence learning. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. So a bit of a disclaimer to start with. So I'm primary based, but the things I'm going to talk about are quite easily adaptable to Key Stage 3 anyway, and are probably things that a lot of you are doing as part of your practice. So I'm going to look at mini inquiry questions. It's something we've been working on, just because I know a lot of people will use kind of big inquiry questions, thinking about maybe 4 or 5 lessons and having the big inquiry question, but actually looking at how we can kind of break that down and really sequence our learning clearly just through these kind of mini inquiry questions and how that links into some of the principles of instruction. So just to think about why we use inquiry questions, lots of us, it's kind of that nice way of structuring and planning. It's engaging students and thinking about the ways in which they might answer or go about finding those answers. And it gives us that nice open-ended learning. So we can think about within that question, right, where do we want the learning to go? How's that kind of open-endedness in there? But it can be a bit challenging sometimes, particularly if we're trying to create a bigger question for, say, 5, 6 lessons as part of a bigger sequence. Actually, sometimes getting that open-endedness, but with that specificity, can be a bit of a challenge. So for me, getting that specificity sometimes actually is kind of easy if we then go into the smaller steps, think about mini inquiry questions. So as I said, it's probably something some of you do anyway, but for me, it's thinking really about what's the key learning and actually thinking about it as learning sequences rather than lessons. So it might be that an inquiry lasts 2.5 hours, it might be an inquiry lasts half an hour, and actually it's kind of really breaking down what it is you want them to know as part of that. So breaking down the learning, as it said, it's a nice chance to constantly come back to that review. So because we're focusing on one inquiry, we're going to focus on that. What do we know right before we go on to the second inquiry? The third inquiry is part of that sequence. And it also provides a nice chance for written outcomes. So at the end of each of those questions, there's a chance to answer that question. So actually we've got that constant repetition of opportunities for writing and geography as part of that. Thinking about it as a learning sequence. So rather than lesson 1, we're going to do this, lesson 2, we're going to do this, lesson 3, it's inquiry 1, inquiry 2, inquiry 3. So actually thinking about really kind of specifics of what's the learning, what's the geography we want them to have as well, breaking down those themes, but also then showing them the links between the questions, and we'll look at an example in a minute of that as well. So actually then being able to then see the links as they move through the unit in those small steps as part of those questions. So there's an example that I did earlier in the year, looking at rivers with a year 3-4 class. You can see actually as well, what I've done is not necessarily, so they're inquiries rather than necessarily one inquiry question. So like with the first inquiry, what is the water cycle? How does urbanisation affect it? So we're looking at 2 steps in there. So there was 2 opportunities to reflect on that learning. But what I wanted to understand was the water cycle and the urbanisation parts were sitting together. It wasn't that we're doing this lesson on water cycle, we're doing a lesson on urbanisation. Actually, because it all fitted within that one inquiry, they realised actually that it's all linking together. It's building on what they'd already just talked about, then building that into thinking about what rivers are, where we find them, why does flooding happen, why is it important to look after rivers, and a review at the end. So it was very much kind of thinking actually what was the key steps, what were the key inquiries for the knowledge we wanted at the end, for the understanding we wanted at the end, and then about what's the most appropriate amount of time. So it might be one of them, as I say, might actually last 3 hours, one of them might only last an hour, but actually it's those small steps that pupils can understand and see those links as they move through. So for me, it was stronger because it was that constant review. So again, if we're moving away from a 1 hour lesson, we're reviewing an inquiry, we're coming back to that. So it might be, yes, we only do so much of that inquiry in one lesson, but we can then come back to it as a quick review before we then carry on into the next lesson. But it's those small steps. It's that really kind of understanding, really guiding, getting that independent practice through those mini inquiry questions that we can really build on the learning there. So just look at some examples from the river one. So like I said, the first inquiry was what is the water cycle? How does urbanisation affect it? So we work on a booklet scheme. So again, if you're using booklets, it's much easier, I think, in terms of how you can then build that and come back to it. Sometimes with textbooks and activities and not kind of knowing where you are, but actually in terms of using booklets, it's really easy to kind of go, okay, we're at the end of this lesson here, we're going to pick up from here in the next lesson as part of that. So you can see we're looking at focusing on that first question first of all. So what is the water cycle? So the information that comes around that, going through that information, going through the activities, you know, and there's kind of small steps, that guided practice, the independent practice you'd expect to see anyway. And then there's that written opportunity, what's the water cycle? So we're answering that question, we're having a chance to actually look at writing, review what they know from that lesson and that question before we then move on to looking at the urban water cycle. But then it's that thought of we're going to put these together so that actually pupils understand they're still kind of building on what they've learned before within this one inquiry rather than seeing them as separate lessons. So then we're going to look at the urban water cycle, talk about it, discuss it, what's similar, what's different, and then answer that question about how does urbanisation affect the water cycle, knowing that that's then going to build into that third inquiry around flooding as well. So we've already then got that kind of pre-understanding as part of that to then build into our third inquiry, but not seeing it as sitting alone, because we're inquiry 1, inquiry 2, inquiry 3, they can kind of see it building up as they go through. And then you could just see the example there of how we've then gone into the third inquiry. So there's recaps from the second, coming back to that key information, but it's looking at, right, we've talked about urbanisation, what's the link with flooding? It's building that understanding through, okay, it's not separate learning. They can see that actually inquiry 1's linked into inquiry 2, is linked into inquiry 3, rather than having this kind of big overall question and then not sometimes always seeing the link. It's making those links obvious to them in terms of that cognition. And then you can see at the end again, that question then that they can build upon as part of that. But it also, thinking about it from a separate example, gives us a chance to think about the knowledge we want, but also the geographical skills we want them to work on. So for example, here again, you can see we worked on 2 questions. So why do earthquakes happen? What impact do they have? So it's that knowledge of earthquakes, going through it before then actually building in some case studies. So you can then see just in the bottom right-hand corner, we're looking at one case study of earthquakes. So once we've got the knowledge, the understanding, then we're going to look at a second one as well and work on those concepts and those skills then of thinking about primary effects, secondary effects, thinking about links, thinking about why it may have had more effect in one country than the other and what were the mitigating circumstances behind that. So for me as well, the mini inquiry then is quite a nice one of actually we can really kind of focus in on that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of our bigger inquiry around natural hazards, but actually really focusing in on each one at a time. So earthquakes, then volcanoes, then tsunamis, and using kind of a double question of building that knowledge, but then also building up the skills and concepts around that for that understanding. Which I thought then nicely tied into work Michael Childs did. So he's shared lots of work around summary organisers, and using them kind of instead of on a page knowledge organisers. And again, it just ties in nicely with if we've got mini inquiry questions, our knowledge organiser becomes the page for those questions. So again, rather than having one page for a big overall question that might span 5 or 6 lessons, you can kind of have those on a summary per question as part of that. So you can then see the water cycle lesson, the river lesson, the flooding lesson, there's key information, misconceptions, key vocabulary as part of that, which then again just becomes a nice way of kind of summarising that learning as part of that. And that is me, thank you.
Oh, there we go. I'm in. Thank you so much for that, Chris. I thought I was going to be trapped backstage then. But thank you so much for that. I mean, I think it's a really kind of clear highlight that inquiry is the heart of geography, and that we should be developing it kind of as much as we can alongside those obvious kind of knowledge and skills. And those resources look excellent, by the way. I bet they took very long, but they look fantastic. And just to echo a couple of comments that colleagues have been putting in on the chat, it's so useful to hear from primary colleagues and to chat with primary colleagues. Teach Me Icons doesn't specify kind of secondary or primary, but I think that we need to kind of foster that kind of collaboration and the work that we can do together. Because did you say it was a year 3, year 4 class?
Yeah, that one was.
I mean, wow. I mean, what a challenging and ambitious curriculum. So, I mean, really useful. So thanks so much for your time in that.
Thank you.
No problem. And yeah, Helen, I agree. I wish our year 7s came from Chris's school. Such great geography. Yeah, completely second that. Right then, so next up, we've got 3 of us. Oh, there we go. We have got 11:40. We've got Jenny. So Jenny's going to be talking to us about metacognition. So over to you, Jenny. Thank you very much.
Hiya, thank you for having me today. I'm going to talk about something that I've been working on in Key Stage 3, 4 and 5 geography over the last couple of years, and something that we've found has had a really positive impact on our students' ability to write in geography, which is obviously a really important key skill for them. So just to kind of kick off and get started, I'm sure everybody has a bit of a background in metacognition, but essentially it's just about thinking about thinking. It's about equipping students with the tools to understand how they learn so that they're able to self-regulate and learn a bit more independently. And so essentially the principles that underpin this is this cycle of planning, monitoring and evaluating. So students being able to plan how they approach a task, monitor their success as they are completing a task, and then evaluate their success afterwards and maybe think about how they could have improved it a little bit better next time. And so today I'm going to be specifically thinking about how I use this to evaluate cycle within student writing. And I always like to kind of give a little bit of context when I'm talking about strategies that I'm doing, just so we can really understand why it's important that we're doing it. And we can see here around 7.1 million adults in England are classed as functionally illiterate, which means that these people are unable to undertake those simple daily tasks that we take for granted. So writing an email, filling out job applications, all of those things that kind of are second nature to us. And so while obviously what I'm talking about today does link specifically to geography, it's obviously a really core line that we're teaching us, and something I'm really passionate about, especially because I teach students from quite disadvantaged backgrounds. So again, just thinking about that complexity of writing, Quigley compares writing to a game of chess. So he talks about the fact that actually when you're writing, you've got to consider a range of different moves that you need to make. And we as experts, we do this without thinking, we do this in a matter of seconds. So when we're, you know, if I think back to writing a letter or a job, you know, we might need to think slightly, but actually it comes quite naturally and easy to us to know kind of what language to pick, what tone to use, the spelling, the grammar, the handwriting, what the purpose of that writing is. And so what we really need to do is to be able to help our students to unpick these complexities and essentially model them to those students who are essentially novice learners. And we need to equip them with the skills to essentially be able to do this independently, because as we know, we're not always going to be there to support them, either when they kind of go out into life in the future, but also in their exams, as I know that's something that's really important to us all as well. And what I quality of this for a long time is that when we're getting students to complete a piece of written work, we focus really heavily on the planning stage, and we really help our students to plan their piece of writing. And then we kind of let them off, and actually the monitoring stage and the evaluation stage are used much less, particularly that monitoring stage. And I'm going to focus quite a lot on that today, because I would argue that that monitoring stage is actually the true stage that helps our students to be self-regulating and to become kind of independent and expert writers. Yeah, so as I've said here, this monitoring stage is really critical for our students to be able to adapt their strategy midway through, to ensure they're on track, to use that success criteria they created at the beginning to help them. So, you know, they're in an exam and they're answering a 9-mark question, for example. You know, how often do our students actually pause and double check their plan? How often do our students just pause and just think, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing, or am I going a little bit off track here? And we're not there to support our students. It's really, really important that we provide them with the tools to be able to do that independently, and that we model this to them so that they're able to be successful. And it's really quite simple. It's about us teaching these skills explicitly to the students. And I do this through a range of really simple questions. And, you know, us as a department, we came up with the questions that we think we would be able to use most consistently, regularly with our students. So they end up pretty much every time they complete a written task in geography, all the way from Key Stage 3 up to Key Stage 5, seeing those same questions. And it really helps them to become much more independent as learners. And a lot of this guidance has come from the Education Endowment Foundation on metacognition. Really, really useful, a fantastic report, which I would fully recommend going to read. These are our plan questions here. So what knowledge do I need to include? How will I be successful? Getting our students to think about the organisation of their writing, any key vocabulary they need to include, any resources. And so that might be, we use communication maps in our school to support, where they might have some sentence starters on there and some of the command words on there. But equally, you know, if they're answering a question that has a figure attached to it, are they making sure that they're using that resource to support them with their writing? And then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit later about this bottom one, but this for me is a really, really important one, because it's making sure our students are reflective. So they look at a previous question or activity that they've done before and look at what their feedback was, so that they know that they're really focusing on that, including that in this piece of writing. So again, you'll see these mono questions. So this is for, you know, our students to pause and really reflect on how the activity is going, and then, you know, checking themselves against the success criteria. Are they using the right structure? Are they using the right vocabulary? Have they referred back to their resources, either the communication map or the figure? Are they using the correct sentence starters? Already thinking about, you know, how could they make it even better as they continue to complete that piece of writing? And then finally, evaluating. So this can be either immediately, or it can be after they've been given some feedback from their teachers, but thinking about how they did, thinking about what went well, thinking about how they can improve, thinking about, you know, how next time they do a similar task, they're going to make sure that they take those improvements on board. And we use purple and green pen as kind of self-reflection or reflection after marking as well. So just helping our students to think about how they can directly improve that piece of work immediately. And so I'm just going to kind of talk you through an example of how I might use this in practice. So thinking about, we do a little bit around the Grand Renaissance Dam in the River Nile in our Year 9 curriculum. And so thinking about kind of activating our students' prior knowledge, getting them to have a little bit of discussion to help them with their writing. So starting with a talking point just to get that discussion and that prior knowledge activated for them. And then, as I'm sure a lot of you do, we would book the question with them, get them to think about that command word, so evaluate, making sure that our students are already thinking about giving both sides of the argument, reaching a conclusion, really, really ensuring that actually, you know, we're teaching them those skills. Question, which is a critical part of preparing our students for exams as well. And then you will see here, the activity is for them to then use the plan questions to create their own success criteria. And so, apologies, the success criteria was supposed to be animated, but that doesn't seem to have come through. So what I would do is I would initially just have the plan questions up on the board, and depending, this was, you know, whereabouts in the stage of them using these questions would determine how much I support them. So if this was the first time they've ever seen these metacognitive questions, I would model to them the answers. I would talk to them about the knowledge they need to include, where they might get that information from. I would talk to them about the organisation of their writing. I would talk to them about kind of the resources they might need. When our students are more familiar with this, they either do this in pairs together or they do it independently, because it's really, really important that they come up with their own individual success criteria, particularly when looking at that bottom question. So have they done a similar activity before, and what was successful and what needed improving? Because obviously students will have had different feedback from a previous activity. So they need to go and look through their work. They need to have a look at what they did really well last time, but what was something that I fed back to them that they needed to do to improve, to make sure that that goes into their success criteria. And so again, you know, there will be different levels of scaffolding there depending on how familiar. In their feedback as a class, again, depending on at what stage we are, maybe if we're in year 11 and students are close to their exams, I wouldn't, because they need to be doing this independently. But I've just put up then an example of the success criteria that we might put together. So they know, for example, in an evaluate, they need to argue both sides. We use the peel and a cat structure to help with their explanation. So that's kind of helping them to organise their writing. I've put it in a couple of bits of knowledge that they would need to include. So they might have used some sources that we've used in a previous lesson to pick out that knowledge, what they think is the key knowledge or the case study knowledge to include in that question, so that it's there for them to kind of really easily use when they come to writing. And then you can see that I've written, you know, this student's feedback was last time they didn't use that word extent to help with their evaluation. So they need to make sure that they use that in this piece of writing. Then what I would do is I would set them off on that piece of writing, and then sort of after 5-10 minutes, depending on how long the task is, I would pause them. I would make all of the students put their pens down, okay, and so I would get them to, you know, just think, are you checking against your success criteria? Are you using the structure, the peel and the cat structure that we talked about? And again, I might model this to them. I might pull one under the visualizer if I'm kind of at the early stages, and just think about, you know, going through a student's piece of work and say, well, so far I've achieved this on my success criteria. I could improve this vocabulary. I've argued one side. Now I need to make sure I'm arguing the other side. I've still not used that word extent yet. So actually I'm going to go back and I'm going to put that in. But it's really important that we do get students to put their pens down and really reflect at this stage, because otherwise they're just going to carry on writing and they're not really going to be engaging in this monitoring process. And this is key, because this is what the students will then use to actually bring themselves back on track if they have not been following the success criteria or they've been veering a little bit off track. And then again, those evaluation questions at the end, in particular that bottom one that second from bottom one about how they might apply that to a task in the future. And I'm just going to skip through because I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to just share this and just say to you that I think what's really, really important with metacognition and with this process is it is absolutely a marathon, not a sprint. It will take time. It will take a lot of modelling, a lot of scaffolding. The students will get a lot of support. But the reason we really embed it in Key Stage 3 is then by the time they get up to Key Stage 4, they're so used to using those questions, and they're so used to actually just using them second nature. And so, oh, apologies, I wanted to just kind of show you some examples of students have actually answered these questions. So you can see a little reflection here, student looking at whether they wanted, they felt they included a clear point, they explained. Here we can see excellent planning, where the student has kind of identified the knowledge, the organisation that they need to include. Again, really, really fantastic planning here, where the student has absolutely completely planned this out and given themselves key success criteria to include. And then this last example is of a student in the middle of a mock exam. So they've done all of this planning themselves to then make sure they answer that 9-mark question. And I know students are tight on time, but actually we find that if they do this, it is actually quicker for them to write that 9-mark question, and it's of much, much higher quality. And so, but it's really, really important. And I'm just going to leave that student voice up there, up on the board, sorry, up on the screen there for you to see. Just this is some of the things that my students have said around using those metacognitive questions and about, you know, how they find it useful. So thank you very much for listening. If you do have any further questions, please do contact me on Twitter. I'm Jenny at Jenny Campbell 90, and I hope you found today's session useful.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenny. That was really, really useful in kind of explicitly going through those different stages of metacognition. And thanks for sharing those examples at the end. I think it's always really useful to see what it looks like in practice and kind of what different classrooms look like. So thank you, really, really useful. It is now shortly before midday, so we have got our final sponsor break. So for the next 3 minutes, we're going to leave the QR code for the the Geography Pilot, for the new resources, the videos, the games, the quizzes, just in case you didn't get time to try all of them earlier. So it'll be on the screen for the next 3 minutes, and then we'll resume at midday. Right then, hopefully you had a chance to look at one more resource within that. So we'll move swiftly on. Thank you very much also to the company for letting us undertake that Geography Pilot. So it is now midday and we have got our penultimate speaker, which is going to be Amy Cushing, who is going to be talking about supporting students with SEND in the geography classroom, but also on field trips. So a really, really important topic. So over to you, Amy. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Cool. I'm never sure. Sometimes I have connection problems, so it's always nice to check. So I'm here to talk to you about supporting students with SEND in the geography classroom and in fieldwork. My disclaimer is that I'm not a trained SENCO. I'm current head of geography. I am an ex-EAL teacher, so I've got some information on that in this presentation. My focus today is several approaches to particular challenges in geography rather than telling you about specific needs. Just to give a little bit more background, my current school are a regional hub for students with moderate learning difficulties. These students, they are in mainstream classrooms with us in year 7 and 8, and most of them do opt for geography at GCSE. So we are growing as a school in our experience in that. We're in our 2nd year of being that hub for these learners. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of why this matters to me and to us. For me personally, I feel that these are some of the students who need our support the most in all of the fantastic and great topics and activities that we're doing. I do also believe that geography, because of its breadth in content and skills, that it offers something for everyone to excel in. So when we think of these diverse needs, there's something for everyone to excel in our subject. But also how to achieve this inclusion in a busy classroom. All of our classrooms are busy. We've got a multitude of needs in the room. If we're lucky, we'll have a teaching assistant, member of achievement support. We've got a busy workload. You know, we have to meet these needs in what is quite challenging situations, as we're all aware of. So what I wanted to focus on is specific quality first teaching for geography. You know, you'll all have experiences of sitting in CPDs and hearing about how sentence starters can help students with specific learning difficulties. But my last SENCO encouraged me to think about my subject and what was particularly difficult for us. And I'd be keen to hear anyone else's opinion on the chat of other aspects as well. So I've split this into 3. First of all, practicalities. So our huge number of figures that we work with, including colour of them, size of them, as well as the amount. The number of different booklets you get in the exam. I don't know if students have ever said to you, there's a lot on my table. So they've got their answer booklet, their resource booklet, their map. If they've got an access such as a PC, there's something else to add in there as well. We don't have a foundation paper. Most of us will have mixed ability classes. In terms of content and skills, obviously we've got a high amount of content, keywords, case studies. Also, I had to think with my SENCO about the challenge of comprehending another's situation. For example, understanding what it's like to live in an area at risk of coastal erosion, to have your house, your property being threatened with collapse, but not wanting to move. Also, our range of skills, writing at length, numerical, inferring opinions. And then on top of all that, obviously, we've got our fantastic field trips. So the challenge of accessing field work, working in groups, and just in general meeting needs outside of school. So refer to my last SENCO a lot. She was a very inspiring person. And she used to ask us to think about our support in the classroom in 3 steps. So what is the need? What are we doing to address the need, but also, you know, why, how does that strategy we're using address the need? So I did the simple one here about sentence starters. We'll all use those. So the need is my student has a specific learning difficulty. I'm using sentence starters, but this is why, thinking about this is why, this is how it helps with their need. So if it was mini whiteboards, this helps because verbally working with the teacher gives them the confidence in that idea. So just to have a look at, like I said at the start, we needed a strategy that could fit in with our workload and could help a number of students and needs in the room. So my team, we worked together to develop a series of support sheets for Key Stage 3. And because we're able to work together, I have a great team, we're able to produce one of these on an ongoing basis for each lesson. So the difficulty here is that we've got a number of students with moderate learning difficulties in addition to our students with SEND. Some of the things they find it hard with is reading and comprehending from the board, remembering several instructions, understanding key vocabulary, and there's not enough of me and my teaching assistant in the room to work one-to-one with all of these students. So the idea behind these support sheets is that, yes, we can still work with these students one-to-one, but they've got something to be getting on with independently by themselves as well. So I just put a few screenshots of one of our support sheets, so you can see we do rely on pictures. We've obviously got our keyword matchups. We've got some control practice before we get to their full sentence completion themselves. And this doesn't limit students at all. We encourage them very much to, if you've completed this section, please do use the challenge that's on the board. But our achievement support colleagues have fed back that this has been a really useful way to support students and also support them in supporting students. I think we have to remember that our colleagues, teaching assistants, achievement support, they might be in their 5th lesson that day with me, and they're working with our most challenging students, walking all the way around school in the busy corridors. So if I can make it easier for them to help in the classroom, that's really important that I do that. Just another example, and it's on the same theme in that, we've probably all got new EAL speakers, and there's varying levels, of course, isn't there? But we'll all have brand new speakers to English. So we needed a strategy that, again, we could use in a busy classroom, would allow that student some independence to access the learning we're doing, but wasn't us replanning a new lesson every day. So we're trialing this instructions sheet whereby there's kind of a set instruction list. It can be translated into the first language for that student. They then know what they're doing at the start of the lesson, and we've incorporated some activities to review key vocabulary from our speakers who are completely new to English. So this progresses. They have this for the lesson, and the teacher doesn't have to change too much about it. So you can see here we've put in 5 keywords for that activity. It then follows. Oh, I missed that one out actually. It then follows with some practice, putting those words in sentences, and then some open questions as well. Again, with EAL, obviously we heavily depend on pictures to help with this as well. So just briefly to field work and field trips, we're all in that season at the moment, and what can we do to help our students outside of the classroom? So again, I'm using the same approach, thinking what's the need of the student, what am I doing and why, how does it help? So on the screen here, it's just reference to visual impairments and hearing impairments. So students with a visual impairment, that may be colour, but that might be the distance that they can see or the size of text that they need. So just making sure that you've got that booklet that meets the needs of the student, even when we're outside the classroom. Another couple of areas to consider. Students with autism can find the unknown challenging. So are we making sure we've taken the time to go through the plan of the day with students in advance? Why? This is so they know what's happening step by step. I did a residential this year and took some of our really high need students. We repeated this whilst we were there, so that they knew what was coming. Fidget toys as well, making sure you've got those on the coach just like you would in the classroom. A couple of other things to think about as well. Students who have experienced trauma, they may struggle with large groups. Have we considered letting that student just board the bus first or last? Makes them feel safer in what for them can be unsafe situations. Again, students who have attachment difficulties, is there a member of staff going on that trip who they know and they feel comfortable with, so that they can access our field trip as well. I've popped in, and I can share this on my Twitter, but just some references. There are some great resources on supporting students with SEND, like in particular in the geography classroom, which is, like I said, what I wanted to cover, not just these generic support strategies. So I can share this on my Twitter page, and there was a few of the slides that I took out size wise, so I'll pop the whole thing on there, and you can have a look. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Amy, that was brilliant. Thanks so much for all of the time that would have gone into preparing that. I'm sure that there is so much, so many strategies that we can take back in order to meet the needs of pupils with SEND. So I'm really, really grateful for you sharing.
Yeah, thank you. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Which now takes us to our final speaker, and it is by certainly last but not least, but we have now got Alistair Hamill, who is going to be exploring his Atlas of the Underworld, which I'm sure we're all very excited for, Alistair. So over to you. No pressure being the last slot.
Okay, yeah, because everybody's desperate to go and get the kettle on and get the lunch going. Thanks very much, Gemma. Seeing as I'm sharing this screen, can I just check that you're seeing my presentation okay?
Yeah, and the animations are working as well.
Perfect. Great. Excellent. Right. Yes, it's time for a little bit of a field trip, folks, but a field trip to somewhere that maybe you've never been before. A journey with Jules Verne to not quite the center of the earth, but the Atlas of the Underworld. So we're going to do a little bit of subject knowledge boosting here in plate tectonics. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that, and then we're going to finish with a fabulous little website that you can be using with your students in your class that can help them to explore what's really happening underneath our feet. But we do live in a context here with plate tectonics where there are more than a few little misconceptions around. So I want to start off by maybe just addressing this most fundamental one. How do plates actually move? And it's time for us to slay some zombies here, because I'm afraid to tell you the things that appear in most geography textbooks and most Google searches of these lovely little neat convection cells that move around like this, and the plates just happily glide along on top of them. That's not quite what science is revealing as to what's actually happening. So whenever it comes to plate movement, there are two main processes that seem to be at work. And this one, the first one, is the most significant one. It's called slab pull. And it's just the principle that's illustrated by that little animated GIF there of the chain sitting on the edge of the table. And as the end of it dangles down, it will just simply fall down under its own weight and gravity and pull the rest of the chain along with it. So it's something very similar is happening here. And this seems to be the main driver of plate movement. As a result of that pulling movement, you get tension and plate elsewhere. And just like this resistance band, as you stretch it, you thin it, and because the plate thins at that point, it allows the mantle rock to flow up. That's solid, but will flow up towards the plate. It will melt to produce magma, and that magma will force its way into the plate above, young, hot, and high, to form the mid-ocean ridge, and you just simply get the sliding down of the rock again under gravity. As a result of that, shout out to Hafsa Garcia for this amazing GIF to illustrate it. And just in case you're concerned, look, that panda is getting up at the end. That panda is loving this. So misconceptions everywhere. But the main one that I want to focus on with you today is in this plate margins, particularly this notion of the destructive plate margin. And the question is, what actually is being destroyed in a destructive plate margin? Because if you go on and do any kind of Google image searches, you will see all sorts of images like this. The plate goes down and almost immediately it evaporates because it's melting in the mantle, and up goes that magma to form the volcanoes. Guess what? That's not quite the case. I tried to find out where the origins of this notion of the destructive plate margin comes from, but it's hard to find out. The best I can do is the whole idea of seafloor spreading, that if we were looking at the whole idea that seafloor is created at a ridge, and then because the earth isn't expanding, it disappears at the trench, and therefore it must be destroyed, right? But we have a little bit of a problem, because if it's slab pull that's pulling the plates, and if we destroy the slab as soon as it goes down, what's actually moving the plates? What is actually causing that movement to occur if the plate melts? Well, this is much more like what's actually happening at a destructive plate margin. Again, we'll share these slides with you afterwards so you can read over this in detail. I'm just going to focus particularly on this stage here. What is melting? It's not the subducting slab. What is melting is the mantle rock above it. How does that melt? Well, it's the water that is carried down in the slab as it subducts, as it experiences the heat and the pressure in the mantle. That water is forced off the subducting slab into the mantle above, and that acts to lower the melting point of the mantle rock, and that's what produces the magma. The magma rises up to the surface and erupts to form these volcanoes. So that it's the notion of partial melting. So the idea of partial melting is that the rock in the mantle is made up of different elements and some components, some of which will melt first. The ice cream will melt before the sprinkles will. So it's those partial melting that comes up to the surface and produces that island arc. There's some more geekery for you if you want to read that a little bit later on. So how do we know this? How do we see what's happening down in the mantle? Well, first of all, it's with some insights by Oldham in 1906 and Lehman in 1937 that give us the core. But it's the Kiu Wadati of the Wadati-Benioff zone. He sometimes gets a little bit relegated in this story, so I want to tell his story here. In the 1920s, he was noticing shallow earthquakes near the trench in Japan, then an arc of volcanoes, then a deeper deeper earthquakes past the volcanoes. Now, can you visualize that? Because here's what he's able to see. No idea really what's down beneath, but he could see these earthquakes. Then you've got the volcano and then deeper earthquakes. So it seems that whatever is going down there is going past where the earthquakes are. So it can't be completely melting and disappearing. He then did this fabulous isoline mapping technique here where he took all of the depths of the earthquake focuses he had plotted and produced this isoline map. I've added in a little bit of color there so that you can see that. Can you begin to see that angled plane dipping away from the trench, showing that there is something that is brittle enough in the mantle for those earthquakes to occur? Now, I'm not sure how this will share, but I imagine that you can click on the source afterwards. If Wadati had had access to this, it would have blown his mind. We can explore in 3 dimensions that Wadati-Benioff zone of those earthquakes as you go down into the mantle. Have fun with that. That's brilliant to explore with your classes too. A little bit more on there. So what have we discovered as we begin to peer into the mantle in more recent times? Well, welcome to the world of seismic tomography. So this is analogous to the CT scans that you'll get when you're pregnant and to see the baby inside. Congratulations! It's a descending slab of oceanic lithosphere. And this is a little bit of what the tomography has revealed. Here we have the earthquake, and out go those seismic waves. Some of them arrive at the seismometers on time. Some of them are continuing at the same speed. And then some of them get a Super Mario Kart speed boost. So they arrive early, and the rest of these arrive on time. So there is something in that little area where they got the Super Mario Kart speed boost that seems to speed them up. What is that thing? And this is what seismic tomography is beginning to reveal. It's allowing us to peer into the mantle, to actually see what it is that caused those earthquakes that Wadati was able to observe. And it is those descending slabs of lithospheric plates. So we went from that to this kind of model now in terms of what we can see of what actually lies beneath. So if we're taking this as our journey, in the first instance that we were able to move beyond the continental drift theory of Wegener to the seafloor spreading theory of Harry Hess, because they could see the seafloor, Wegener couldn't, and we could see the trench and we can see the depth of the focus of the earthquakes. What seismic tomography has allowed us to do is to see beneath. This is the actual profile of the mantle below the trench at South America. Can you see the slab? There it is, the subducting slab that's coming way past the mantle transition zone and is actually heading way deep, thousands of kilometers into the mantle, close to the core mantle boundary. That slab, whatever it's doing, is not being destroyed. So if we take this data back, I think this is amazing, and take a look at the atlas of the seismic tomography and what it shows beneath Wadati's isolines. There is the slab. Isn't that incredible? The insight that he had using only those pieces of information about the earthquake depth. That's what he was able to visualize. And this is my attempt to try and give it some kind of 3D visualization of what's going on. Okay, what about a field trip to this? So this is the Atlas of the Underworld. This is an amazing website that's very simple to use. This is just an animation that shows you a few of the things to click on this, and you can immediately be drawing transects of any of the plate margins in the world. This can easily be done as a Teach from the Front tool if you have difficulty accessing a computer suite. And there you go. Anywhere in the world, you can draw those transects of actual data of what we're seeing down in the mantle. Now, with my sixth formers, we have a very open bring your own device policy, so I was able to get them to do this. Having modeled it for them, there's me at the top there showing them the kinds of things to observe. This is what they were seeing as they were working their way through. I gave them a series of transects that they could go and explore deep down into the mantle, carrying out actual field work, not just speculation here, and recognizing and noticing that these destructive plate margins, whatever is going on, the slabs are not being destroyed. In actual fact, it allows us to go and explore a whole range of different ways in which the slabs subduct. So rather than just as we would with rivers, we don't just take the Bradshaw model and say every river must be like that. We take the Bradshaw model and we test it. This allows us to do exactly the same with plate tectonics. We can take the model and test it out. We can do geography in plate tectonics in the same way that we do in any other subject. So that is our field trip today. We're just past the field trip fortnight, and you can now say you've had a virtual field trip to the center of the earth.
Alistair, thank you so much. I mean, what incredible subject enhancement, but also that section at the end, how we can actually incorporate fieldwork into plate tectonics is brilliant. And the comments that are kind of going into the chat now are kind of echoing everything that you just said. Outstanding use of technology in the classroom. Thank you so much. I feel as though we could have listened to you for another half an hour talking about all of that up-to-date research and up-to-date subject knowledge. So thank you very much for the time that must have gone into that presentation. And by the way, excellent use of GIFs.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Big fan. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a great day. So everyone, all that's left for me to say is a massive thank you to all of our wonderful speakers today. I feel as though we've taken so much from such a kind of wide array of the geography classrooms up and down the countries and further afield potentially. Everybody, there's presentation links being shared. I've tried to keep an eye on social media, and there's a lot of extra kind of links and support there. So thank you once again. Thank you for everyone taking the time. Essentially, Teach Me Geography Icons relies on volunteers, goodwill, kind of you giving up your free time to watch, to attend, to share, to present. And I actively encourage all of you that maybe haven't presented before to give it a go, because we learn from each other and we can only continue to better our practice by fostering and collaborating together. Got to say thank you to Kelly Pepin, the other geography coordinator, who has been behind the scenes tweeting and doing all things social media, and to Tom Rogers, who has been behind the scenes working on all the technology and the technological requirements. So I hope you have a lovely day, and I look forward to seeing what is shared in the geography community sphere in the future. Thank you very much.